Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Ben.
So, in my research, I came across a wonderful quote from you, which I'm going to quote back to you, and I think it'd be a lovely place to start, which is, "You've never told a patient to eat less and move more." Why not? And why do you feel like that is a bad thing to say to patients looking to lose weight?
What I've found is that most people think that is the default dietary advice, whether it's for healthy eating or weight loss, maybe more specifically weight loss. But when people are coming to see me, they're already eating less and moving more. Like people are often already trying everything. And even if they're not trying actively at that time that they see me, they've done it in the past. We always ask patients about their history with dieting. What have you tried before when it comes to weight loss or health gain or improving energy, whatever it may be. And almost everybody has tried to eat less and move more. And for some people, it's successful at the time, right? I'm not denying that it can be effective for weight loss. It's a very widely studied approach for weight loss. However, the problem with the eat less and move more kind of advice is that it's a relative term, right? Like eat less, move more. It's not telling anyone anything about what their energy requirements actually are. So oftentimes what happens is someone goes to see their doctor, they're sitting there, they're overweight. And simply because they're overweight, their doctor says, oh, well, you're eating too much. You've got to eat less. But that person could be eating 1,500 calories a day, maybe 1,800 calories a day. They could already be trying their hardest to eat less. And if their doctor says, eat even less, right, they can get into dangerous territory. Calories are not optional. They are essential components. That's how we get energy. And so, if you look deeper into the research beyond the popular weight loss diets, you actually see that, almost all diets fail with regards to maintaining weight over the long term. And it's because our body adapts. If you eat less and that's your only strategy for weight loss and you just keep eating less and less and less, and now you're under eating energy relative to your requirements long term, your body will adapt. And it adapts by suppressing your resting metabolic rate. Now, I personally have had a lot of issues with a suppressed metabolic rate, but so have pretty much all of my patients. As I said, most people have tried these diets in the past, metabolic rate drops, and that can lead to serious issues. So beyond weight, it can lead to depression, anxiety, disordered eating, infertility, and so many more issues, fatigue, brain fog, cognitive dysfunction. And people don't realize that. People don't put two and two together that, oh, because I've been under eating for so long, it's causing all of these health issues. Because it's the common advice, everybody preaches it, eat less and move more. So they think they're doing the right thing, but no one's really taken the time to fully explain what an effective approach to healthy eating actually looks like.
It's really, really salient point. I came across a question recently, which was, what stories do we tell ourselves that are bullshit? I feel like there's this societal one where we really normalized being in a calorie deficit for a prolonged period of time as just normal, how you look good for your holiday or this or that. And or justified through the lens of, oh, daily intermittent fasting is wonderful for you, but actually taking your calorie intake over a week, you're in a chronic deficit. And then the knock-on effects of that. I mean, I think you would you say that the simplistic approach of just calories in, calories out, well, would you agree that is simplistic and sort of doesn't quite tell the full picture?
Yeah, I do. Because, even if we think about a, really common example, which is insulin resistance, right? Like insulin resistance is, a resistance to this hormone insulin that is responsible for, telling your body which fuel you're going to burn and also, how much energy you're going to burn as well. So just to put it really, really simply, if insulin levels are really high because you've got insulin resistance, so your body's making lots of that insulin, then your ability to burn fat is basically switched off, right? And so that reduces the amount of energy your body's going to burn in a day if you can't access fat as an energy source. You're purely limited to using glucose, which is your other energy source, right? So the total amount of energy you're burning in a day, even if calories in equals calories out, blah, 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 it's going to be less with that hormonal change. But I guess the thing which, even now, like I get a lot of people messaging me and they're like, okay, I want to eat more, but like I just don't get it because right now I'm eating 1,500 calories a day and I'm gaining weight. So like, how could I possibly eat more and not gain weight? But essentially with this approach that we talk to our clients about, the initial focus isn't necessarily on weight loss. The initial focus is on boosting the metabolic rate, right? So we help their body actually take in more calories to burn more calories. So it's not just about eating more of anything, right? It's about eating more of specific types of foods to maximize the amount of energy your body's going to burn. And I feel like the calories in, calories out sort of hypothesis, it's too robotic, right? Like our bodies, we're not robots. It just can't possibly work like that. And I guess like another maybe more extreme example is people who are injecting themselves with insulin, right? So if you have type 1 diabetes and you're injecting yourself with large doses of insulin, you could be eating like no calories, right? Or very little calories. But if you're injecting large doses of insulin, you're going to rapidly gain fat because that hormone is responsible for storing fat. It's a growth hormone. So I think because of the powerful role of hormones and the adaptations that our body makes to respond to calorie deficit, it can't be as simple as calories in, calories out.
I agree. And I can hear multiple people over the years sort of, they throw the Newtonian physics at you. It's just, it's basic thermodynamics. It's like, well, it's not basic thermodynamics, right? There's knock-on effects of, and then what, right? You're in a calorie deficit for so long. What then happens to, as you said, your basal metabolic rate and hormones and cortisol and everything else downstream of that? So whatever route we get to it, if one is normalized being in a calorie deficit for too long, maybe male and female, what are the knock-on effects of that, of how people show up to everyday life? And what are the things, maybe some symptoms that people have normalized? Like what are they?
Yeah. Well, I think probably the biggest one, the most common one, is low energy. And this one can be a little bit tricky to, I guess, understand when you think about your own life, because as you just mentioned, when your metabolic rate is suppressed and you're not eating enough energy from the diet, what tends to happen is adrenaline and cortisol kind of kick in to give your body the energy that it needs. So I find that a lot of people, especially females, rather than necessarily feeling low in energy, they often feel this kind of like tired but wired kind of high cortisol state. Because you ask them, like, what are your energy levels like? And they often say, oh, I'm doing, a 10,000 kilometer walk, 10,000 step walk every single day. I'm looking after 3 kids. I'm, rushing around at work. I've got high pressure, roles, et cetera, et cetera. Like they're doing everything they need to do. They've got the energy, but it's fake energy from cortisol just pumping through their system because they're not eating enough. And so that can affect sleep. So insomnia is a consequence of not getting enough energy and having suppressed metabolic rate. But then, if this is something that goes on for a long time, it goes far beyond energy levels. So mood is one thing that gets significantly impacted, and it can show up in different ways. So it can show up as anxiety, panic attacks, but it can also show up as depression and disordered eating. And this is kind of how I got into all of this because, when I was a teenager, I had an eating disorder myself. And, when I got out of school and I was going into uni, I was trying to figure out, why did that happen to me? Because, I was very healthy minded before I started dieting. And the dieting approach that I took initially was this eat less and move more approach, right? The approach that the government recommends, that is widely recommended. So, I thought I was doing that in a healthy way. But then somewhere along the line, that like good intention diet turned quite toxic. And I never really understood that until later on when I was looking at, research studies looking into human starvation. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the Ansel Keys starvation study, the Minnesota experiment.
It'd be great if you give me a little background on that. Would be great.
And sorry if you can hear my daughter screaming in the background. Apologies. So with the Minnesota starvation experiment, it's really interesting. I mean, they measured lots of different things. I'm really only taking a snippet of it when I talk to people about it. But essentially they took healthy-minded university students, all men. They did rigorous psychological testing. So before the starvation diet, the men none of them had depression or anxiety or disordered eating or anything like that. And so what they did is they reduced their calories by 50%. So they didn't withhold all food. It was just an eat less approach, I guess, low calorie diet. And then they sort of measured all their outcomes after, I think it was 6 months. It might have been 3 or 6 months. I can't remember off the top of my head. And so what they found is that these men developed depression, they developed anxiety, but something that I found was really interesting is they developed disordered eating behaviors. And so I often talk to people about disordered eating being a symptom of a suppressed metabolic rate. And often people think about it the other way around, right? Like they think about the disordered eating as being like a behavior that person is choosing to do, right? Like if you haven't had an eating disorder and you kind of think about people with disordered eating, like you just think, why are they starving themselves? Why are they doing this to themselves? That's what everybody used to say to me. But actually, in most cases, and I would say all the cases of clients I have worked with and spoken to, they went into, a diet or dietary changes with all the best intentions, oftentimes following advice from healthcare professionals. And so they're trying to do the right thing, but by not eating enough calories and their metabolic rate goes down so much, the brain changes and their body makes these adaptations. And, part of that is cognitive function is impaired, right? And disordered eating and those behaviors associated with that can be a consequence. So particularly with, binge eating, I would definitely say, that behavior is for sure a consequence of a suppressed metabolic rate.
Wow, I hadn't actually heard of that study before. It's really interesting. I'm a bit of a human guinea pig, so I've played around with all sorts of different things, and this is not advice for anyone to even do that. But I've done multiple day fasting before. I've done one meal a day for months on end, and that extreme high cortisol state and like running off that. At the start, I felt like actually this feels quite good, but then over time, it's not good at all. And I just you get blood work done in that state, and you just see where everything's going wrong. For someone who you mentioned eating disorders and this this view of restriction. So when someone who has maybe for years sort of compounded these like mental habits, and I'm trying to be careful with my words here because I appreciate it's so nuanced and individual specific, but when someone has a certain pattern of behavior they've reinforced for over years, how do you go about changing how they see the world so actually more calories and less restriction is favorable? Because that seems like quite a hard knot to untie.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, we often spend a lot of time with patients helping them do this on an individual level. So I absolutely appreciate it's easier said than done. And especially not just because it's something they've been doing for a long time, but it's the message that we keep hearing, right? Eat less, move more. And so to go against that feels very uncomfortable and very foreign, especially for someone who's, desperately trying to control their weight or improve their health. So look, I think the first thing, I guess, to reflect on, and we collect this information in our assessment, but we really do encourage our own patients to reflect on this themselves, because oftentimes before seeing us, they haven't done that. But we want our patients to reflect on the diets they've tried in the past, just like what you did then. How, you were like, okay, I've done this 1 meal a day thing, I've done this fasting thing, or maybe they've tried, light and easy, or like a juice cleanse or something like that. So we get them to reflect on that diet. How did you feel while you're on the diet? How much weight did you lose? And then we ask them, well, what happened after that diet? Like, why did you stop? What happened after? Did you maintain those benefits? What was your relationship with food like? And what is it like now? And simply by asking those questions and reflecting on that, oftentimes they come to realize, wow, like that diet actually, maybe it led to a bit of weight loss at the time, but it made me feel like crap. Or, I was so hungry, my energy was so low. And you know what? Before I started that diet, I had a really good relationship with food. But since that diet, I just find myself going on and off diets, like a never ending kind of cycle. So I think step one is to reflect on what you've done in the past and how that actually made you feel. Because I think a lot of times, just at first glance, people think of those diets as being really positive. Like they might say, yeah, I did light and easy and I lost 30 kilograms and it was so good, I need to get back on it. But then when you say to them, yeah, but why didn't you keep going with it? Like, why did you stop? They're like, oh, it was too hard, unsustainable, I got too hungry, I was depressed. And you're like, well, do you really think we should get back on that approach? Do you think that was the right approach for you? So really getting people to, I guess, question that standard approach of eating less and moving more. And then I think, the next step is to, I guess, educate people on what their resting metabolic rate is and how much energy their body actually needs. Because oftentimes it's more than people think. Most of these weight loss diets out there, and even a lot of like meal plans given by personal trainers or whoever, they're often like 1,400 calories a day or 1,600 calories a day or maybe 1,800 calories a day at most, right? And people look at those diets and they immediately see that number and they think, okay, cool, that's the number I need to lose weight, without actually looking at their own individual energy requirements first. So most people don't even know what a resting metabolic rate is. So I'll just explain it. It is the amount of energy that your body needs or requires at rest. And that doesn't mean like what you and I are doing here. So it doesn't mean sitting down, having a chat. It literally means like if you are laying flat in a dark room, in an induced coma, ideally not, but if you were, like your brain wasn't even on, right? It wasn't switched on. There was literally no energy being burned outside of keeping your organs alive. That is your resting metabolic rate, okay? And that's different for everybody, but on average, a resting metabolic rate for a female is around 1,500 calories a day. For a male, it's around 1,800 calories a day. And so you can see now why these diets are so detrimental. Because if you're only consuming 1,500 calories a day, that's the amount of energy you need at bare minimum just to survive. Not the amount of energy you need to go out and walk the dog twice a day, to go and work for 8 hours a day, to, go and do weights and socialize and do the grocery shopping and, put the kids to bed and make their lunches. Like you don't have energy for all of that. You have energy for lying down in a dark room and going to sleep. Right?
That's I've never heard that put that way, because the assumption is when basal metabolic rate gets thrown about is that's your basic, that's just your calories you need just to chill for the day. You're not going running 10K or anything. That's just you doing you at home, as opposed to, as you said, you're, in a coma. I mean, it's quite a good thought experiment at least, right? So
Yeah.
even if you reason up from that, that would just affect the whole your whole view on your own calorie intake quite
Mm,
significantly.
absolutely, yeah. But some people may then still say, well, yeah, I want to be in a calorie deficit, right? So it makes sense that I only eat 1,500 calories a day. That's the minimum my body needs, right? But then basically what you're saying is for all those other activities that you're doing throughout the day, you want your body to burn body fat. And our body does not work like that. Our body does not like to burn lots of body fat. It just doesn't make sense, right? Because, when we're burning through body fat for energy, that's generally a stressful environment, like, a famine or something like that, right? So the body doesn't like doing it. The body wants to be in energy homeostasis. It doesn't want to be letting go of all this energy. So no, your body is not going to just happily tap into stored energy and give you all the energy you need for the day. So, there are some research studies to say that at most, the body can use 250 to 500 calories from body fat each day if the conditions are right. So if we think about someone who maybe their energy requirements, like for their daily activities to fuel them across the day, let's say they need 3,000 calories a day, but they're only eating 1,500 calories a day, maybe they can get 250 calories from their body fat, right? You can still see how much of a calorie restriction that is. And so because that's such a severe calorie restriction based on what they need, they're not getting the energy that they need. Their body starts turning down the resting metabolic rate. And so what that actually means is less energy goes to the brain, less energy goes to your gut, less energy goes to your sex hormones. Your body's just like prioritizing, what do I need to survive? Let's give that a bit of energy. And then everything else, let's give it less energy because we have to learn to survive on less energy. That's what it means when your resting metabolic rate is suppressed. And so, depression, anxiety, gut issues, infertility, all these things, that plague us today could be because we're simply just not eating enough.
Wow. It's such a simple notion, but such a powerful notion as well, because it goes invisible in a lot of society, and it's post rationalized as these healthy things that should be normalized all the time. I mean, like fasting, for example. Um, so okay, so one is in a semi-starvation state, might be a better term, as you alluded to it earlier. Uh, that has a knock-on effect on your brain chemistry, and as a result, it's probably quite hard when you're in that state to be reflective on how do I actually feel, right? It's easy now looking back on previous diets, but actually in the moment must be quite hard. So, which I thought was kind of an interesting point. When it comes to the factors that actually affect basal metabolic rate, when someone's trying to think about this, um, what should they consider? The 1,500 or the 1,800 for men, where do you even go from that to try and figure out your own basal metabolic rate?
Yeah. I just want to say one thing first that I might have forgot to say before, because that's a good point. When you're like deep in that sort of semi starvation state, sometimes, you don't necessarily always feel those symptoms, especially if you're kind of like earlier on in your dieting journey. If you've just started eating less and moving more, or maybe it's kind of working for you. But one other sort of consequence, which is really like the biggest consequence, so I wanted to make sure I got it in here, is weight loss resistance. Because once your body starts burning less energy, once your metabolic rate goes down, it is so hard to keep the weight off that you have lost, or lose more weight. And so this is usually why most diets fail, because even if people keep going with the diet, like even if they've got the willpower, they're committed and they can keep doing it, pushing through hunger, pushing through low energy, etc., eventually their body's going to put the brakes on, right?
Mm,
In most cases, not all.
yes,
So I just wanted to mention that as well.
please do.
Um, yeah, yeah. So going back to, okay, how can we get a better understanding of how much energy our body needs? Look, there are different ways you can actually go and measure your resting metabolic rate. But this is a little bit of a tricky one because, as I just said, For most women, their resting metabolic rate should be around 1,500 calories a day, right? But most women also have a history of low calorie dieting. So their metabolic rates are suppressed. So perhaps they're only burning 1,200 calories a day or 800 calories a day. Maybe that's what their metabolic rate has gone down to. But our goal is to bring it back up to its max potential, wherever that is, right? So that's just one thing to think about. But if we're kind of zooming out further and we're thinking, okay, well, let's just say our resting metabolic rate is, let's just assume, we're a female, average female, let's just assume it's 1,500 calories a day, right? Because the resting metabolic rate is mainly dependent on like your body size, like how many cells you have and all that sort of stuff. Because it's not really got anything to do with your daily activities, right? That's an add-on. Your daily activities, your stress, the amount of like mental demand you have, that all gets added on to the resting metabolic rate. So that's what you have to think about next. Let's just choose 1,500 calories as a starting point. So then we think about, okay, what do we need to kind of multiply this by to account for structured activity? So we need to think about, is this person doing yoga, weightlifting? Do they have like a really physically demanding job? How many kids are they throwing around each day? So we have to think about those daily activities. We then have to think about like mental demand. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people talk about. And there's really not that much research on it either. So it's a little bit tricky to calculate, but it does need to be factored in. Because we know the brain is the most energy demanding organ. And I think this is where a lot of people go wrong, because they might have high pressure jobs, like they might be a CEO or something like that. But they're stuck in an office. So they're very sedentary. And so they have this idea that they don't need a lot of energy. Their energy requirements are not high because they're not doing physical activity. Yet, their brain is making thousands of decisions every single day. And that is where most of our energy gets spent. So mental energy needs to be factored in too. The other thing that needs to be factored in is your goals. So if you have a goal to build muscle, for example, you need to be in an energy surplus. So that gets taken into account. If you have stress or inflammation in your body, we know that stress and inflammation increases your energy requirements. And so a simple example, but maybe like a drastic example, is if you think about somebody who has had severe burns to the majority of their body, let's say they're in ICU, they're unconscious, maybe they're being fed through a tube while they're in ICU. We have to, when we're calculating the energy intake for that person, sometimes double or triple the calories we give them, because their body is burning so much energy because of all the inflammation. And so obviously that's a drastic example, but we know that today a lot of people are living with inflammation, whether that's like joint issues or, autoimmune disease, gut issues, things like that. So all these things that I'm talking about increase your energy requirements for the day. So if we're thinking about, say, if we want to use myself as an example, I don't do strenuous activity. I would say sort of moderate activity. I have like a high mental demand, right? I don't really have much inflammation in my body. My daily energy requirements are about 3,000 to 3,300 calories a day. Okay, so that's kind of just like not to gain or lose fat. It's not to build muscle or anything like that, just to keep me as I am, 3,000 calories a day. Now, most people would be like, that's way too much, right? Surely you're going to gain weight if you eat that amount of food. For context, I weigh 68 kilos. I don't know what that is in pounds.
No, but please, kilos, because I have no idea about pounds either. 68. I mean, I'm good with kilos, but let's just convert that to pounds really quickly for our US listeners. That's 149 pounds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
though. I mean, that really surprises me because I would think that's good for me, but I mean, I'm 95 kilos,
Oh, yeah.
which means I'm probably really undercutting it.
Yep. Men, I find, are most at risk of undereating unintentionally, right? So women are generally intentionally undereating, whereas men are unintentionally undereating. Because, yes, you're right. If I need 3,000 calories a day to support me, then you would likely need 4 to 5,000 calories a day. And, that's not to say you can't survive on less. Absolutely, you could, right? Like, our bodies are designed to withstand periods of famine and withstand periods of energy shortage, right? So you don't necessarily have to be eating that every single day to thrive. But yeah, on most days, to thrive, to really get the most out of our bodies and to feel the best we can, most people need to eat more. And of course, we're talking about the right types of foods, and we can get into that. You can't just eat 4,000 to 5,000 calories of junk, right, and expect to have good results. But yes, definitely, I would say that most people are not eating enough.
Wow. It sort of popped a real bubble for me because I've long been fascinated in endocrinology and testosterone, both male and female, and just the hormones in the body in general. And there's a lot of majoring in minors when it comes to boosting natural testosterone in males, where people are focused on this supplement or this diet or that. But actually, more often than not, if they just start eating more, everything works out quite favorably. But that's popped a massive bubble of, well, what actually is eating more? I would have thought 4,000 calories for me is all good. That's quite a lot. But actually putting it into perspective, using yourself as an example, which I really appreciate you doing, maybe I need to reassess that, which is, yeah, fascinating. Pops a bubble. So when it comes to how people view calories in, calories out, right? As you said earlier, viewing it from like a starvation point of view, it's not equal. But also, if you're trying to eat in a surplus or eat enough calories in a healthy way, it's very different if you eat junk or healthy food. So, how do we determine what is healthy? What do these good calories look like? What do these bad calories look like? And then I'd love to actually just get into the difference between low carb and low calorie because I think you have a nice piece on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it really is going to depend, not entirely, but what we have to factor in is, does this person have a suppressed metabolic rate? Because if someone does have a suppressed metabolic rate, we do have to be a little bit more specific about what types of foods they're bringing in and eating more of. So let's go through this example first. So, if we're trying to boost someone's resting metabolic rate, we definitely need to prioritize protein and increase protein as like the main component of an extra calories. And the main reason for this, well, there's lots of reasons, but I guess some of the top reasons are that protein itself actually does require a lot of energy to metabolize. So your daily energy expenditure goes up. So essentially what I'm saying, sorry, is that you burn calories by eating protein. Um, we also have research to say that not just our daily energy expenditure from the metabolism and digestion of protein, but your actual resting metabolic rate, the thing we've been talking about that we're trying to boost, that increases by about 15% just by eating more protein. And then we also know that protein food, so we're not talking about protein powder now, but protein food is some of the most nutrient dense food available, right? So like meat and fish and eggs and dairy, these are very nutrient dense food. So there's a lot of micronutrients. So nutrients like iron, B12, zinc, omega-3 fatty acids, magnesium, these micronutrients help your body to produce energy. And so oftentimes a suppressed metabolic rate, yes, it's due to a calorie deficit, an extreme calorie deficit, but oftentimes it's also due to nutrient deficiencies that come with a calorie deficit, but they can also be related to other things too, right? So like you could be eating all the right types of foods perhaps, but if you've got a magnesium deficiency, your body will not be able to produce energy or enough energy. So we want to, yes, increase calories from protein as a priority, but make sure we're choosing protein foods that are particularly nutrient dense to help our body produce more energy. So that's kind of like step one, I guess. And then step two is we want to get the majority of our actual energy from fats. So when it comes to the three macronutrients, proteins, fats, carbs, really protein is not an energy source. It's more like a building block, right? It forms your muscles, your connective tissue, bones, enzymes, hormones, etc. So we need lots of it every single day. And as I just said, it increases your metabolic rate, but it's not a source of energy. Energy comes from carbohydrates and fats. Now, there's quite a lot of research to show that if you increase energy from fats and decrease energy from carbs, or make fat the primary source of energy, then your metabolic rate increases. And when we look at studies that are looking at low carbohydrate diets for weight loss, oftentimes we see that low carbohydrate diets can contribute to the same amount of weight loss or even more weight loss than standard low fat diets, but without the need for calorie restriction, which is super interesting. So you do not have to restrict calories if you keep the carbs low, you keep the fat high. So most people who are coming to me wanting to eat more, they also want to lose weight. So this is a really important point because they're so afraid that by eating more food, they're going to gain weight. So if we keep the carbs low and get the majority of energy from fat, we keep blood sugar stable, we keep insulin low. So coming back to the hormonal role of fuel utilization. And we put that body in a position that it can actually burn through all those extra fats that we're putting in. And then even within the context of fats and carbs, we still need to be thinking about, okay, what are good real food, whole food sources of both of those? What are the most nutrient dense sources of both of those, right? So we're getting the most bang for our buck, I suppose. And with fats, it's really, really interesting because, there's this whole argument about like what is a healthy fat, right? Like people are still so confused. What is a healthy fat? But the way that I like to think about it is what types of fats can your body actually use for energy and recognize as an energy source? So, in the kind of standard dieting world, we are told to eat margarine and vegetable oils like canola oil. We're told to, stop eating saturated fats like butter, cut the fat off our meat, etc., etc. Now, with those types of fats like vegetable oil, margarine, etc., their chemical structure is such that your body cannot use them for energy. So if you eat a high-fat diet that has lots of those fats, your mitochondria can't turn that into energy. It's not going to increase your metabolic rate. You're going to feel terrible, inflammation is going to increase, etc. So it's very important when we talk about getting energy from fats, we're actually going for those real food fats that our body can use for energy. And that to me is what defines a healthy fat. And I know everyone has a different way of looking at it, but I thought that was worth sharing.
Absolutely, it really is, and it does get complicated when the spectrum between insulin resistance to burning fat and being in a state of ketosis, that spectrum and sort of getting there and that in between period can get very confusing, especially when insulin comes into the picture as well. And is it bad? Is it good? Who knows? Well, we do know, but especially when it comes to fats of vilifying sort of the most nutrient dense foods and the fat that comes with it, such as animal fat. And I think the research is pretty robust now. That's all good, right? When it comes to Actually, I want to shift gears because I know you have a lovely study on. Maybe we go into diabetes now. Actually, let's go into diabetes. Um,
We can really talk about diabetes. That's
yeah,
fun.
I want to see this at time because I feel like you're very interesting. I can speak to you about speak to you for ages about one specific topic. So you in type 2 diabetes, let's go there and we'll go type 1 after. People have insulin resistance, so they're the opposite of metabolically flexible, right? You know, the body can't burn their own fat for energy very easily. They've sort of been in a state of sort of hypernourishment, for lack of a better term, for years. So they're eating too many junk calories, and as a result, insulin resistance uh, has come about. How do you think about working with someone with type 2 diabetes and getting them to this sort of more metabolically flexible place, which seems to be the goal? And correct me if I'm wrong there.
Mm. It's so interesting because, like, yeah, as you're kind of alluding to, with type 2 diabetes, it's another way of like your body. I mean, it's a metabolic disaster, right? Like your metabolism is not working properly at all when you have type 2 diabetes. It is a real disaster. But one of the things that is happening is that you have low energy availability, which is essentially the same as a suppressed metabolic rate. Um, but the causes are different, right? So, like when we were talking about a suppressed metabolic rate, we were talking about people who are just under eating energy, right? Like not giving their body enough energy. Now, with type 2 diabetes, that's not necessarily the cause of type 2 diabetes. Like you usually don't get type 2 diabetes by not eating enough food, right? And so with type 2 diabetes, as you said, what is kind of like the background cause or the main contributing factor is insulin resistance. So the body is making lots and lots of insulin over many years or decades in attempt to keep blood sugars as stable as possible. But eventually the body can't keep up, right? Like it's kind of maxed out its insulin production and then it can't control the blood sugars anymore. So they start to rise. And that's what type 2 diabetes is. So once you get a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, that's like 10 years, maybe 20 years after the problem even started, right? So this is why I call it a metabolic disaster. But the reason it contributes or leads to this low energy availability is kind of what we were talking about before. With people that have type 2 diabetes, particularly if it's not well managed, their insulin levels are essentially high all of the time, like 24/7. You know, even if they fast for 14 hours, their insulin levels are still high, right? Because their body is just producing so much. And there's other reasons for that too we can get into. But when your insulin is high, your body cannot burn fat. It doesn't even see it. It doesn't even know it's there, right? So you could have someone who's obese with type 2 diabetes. They've got all this energy stored on their body, right? But their body, their brain has no idea that it's there. It cannot tap into it because of this hormone being so high, right? So people who, have type 2 diabetes still need energy, right? They're just like the rest of us. Their brain needs energy, their muscles need energy. Arguably, they need more energy because, if they are overweight and they've got more cells in their body, they need more energy, right? But if you cannot access fat as an energy source, that limits you to only being able to use glucose. That's your only other option. And so oftentimes this is what drives people to eat more carbohydrates. Like they get cravings and they feel shaky and weak all the time. Like this is people with type 2 diabetes. So they end up eating all these carbohydrates, right? Because their physiology is kind of driving them towards that because they cannot burn fat, but they still need lots of energy just like the rest of us, right? And so even if they try to fast, they try to stop eating, and let's say they are successful with that, unfortunately, in type 2 diabetes, what can happen is their body just makes extra glucose, right? Because you cannot go without energy. Your brain can't just go without energy for an hour. It's not possible. You have to have energy all of the time. In a healthy person that doesn't have type 2 diabetes, when they're not eating, their body will burn fat. overnight while you're asleep. Your body's using fat. You don't need to get up and eat while you're asleep, but you need a lot of energy while you're asleep. Someone with type 2 diabetes, they can't burn fat. So this is a huge stress. This is a huge problem. So type 2 diabetes isn't just about insulin resistance. It's about this lack of energy availability. And also their body is making excessive glucose, right? So you can see how this is like such a negative cycle and very overwhelming for people with type 2. It's like, how do I get out of this, right? So in terms of what do we do, it's kind of like a similar approach, but we have to be extremely mindful that their blood sugars and their insulin are already high. Even at baseline, before they've woken up for the day, those two things are already high. So really, the only option when it comes to a successful dietary intervention is a low-carb diet. Because when we look at the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates increase blood sugars. Carbohydrates turn into glucose once they are metabolized. So we have to keep carbohydrate content very, very low, particularly at the beginning, right? Really, really low, because insulin and glucose is already high. But if that's the only thing you do, you will not be successful. Like if all you do is cut out carbs, it's not going to work, because that's not giving the body energy, right? That's just taking an energy source away. And as we said, type 2 diabetes, those brains, the body, they're just screaming out for energy. And so we have to increase the fats quite significantly for people with type 2. And again, this is like a hotly debated topic, because like even people within the low carb space, you know, they're starting to like lean into, oh, well, maybe we should also restrict calories, even though, you know, most of the science in terms of low carb for type 2 diabetes does not use calorie restriction. But people are finding that just restricting the carbohydrates on their own isn't always enough. And that's because their body is making this extra glucose. Their body needs more energy. But we still have that perception that, oh, well, they're overweight, so therefore they can just tap into body fat. But they can't. So we have to increase the fat significantly. Because when we increase the fat in their diet, you know, beyond what we think they need, right? I always tell patients to just put as much healthy fat on your plate as you can. But when we increase the fat, what happens is you're giving the brain a source of energy that it can recognize, right? In the context of a low carb diet. If you have lots of fat and lots of carbs together, it's not going to work. But if you keep the carbs low and you have plenty of healthy fats, the brain starts to recognize, okay, there's energy coming in that it can use and metabolize without needing to produce even more insulin. So the brain can then basically shut off those signals to produce cortisol. And the reason the brain is producing lots of cortisol in type 2 diabetes is because cortisol produces glucose, which is a source of energy. So this is why people with type 2 have high glucose levels even when they're not eating, because their cortisol levels are high. So the extra fats helps to kind of bring down that cortisol response, get them back to a kind of normal baseline where their body isn't just excessively making sugar. And then following, you know, your kind of protein-based low-carb diet moving forward with sufficient energy is basically what you need to be sustaining so that the insulin sensitivity can improve. And we don't have a lot of good research that tells us how long that takes. So, you know, people often ask like, okay, cool, how long do I need to do this for before I can just go back to my normal diet? And like it, you know, oftentimes you can't go back to your normal diet. I think we need to think about, how did you get here in the first place, right? Like, you know, is type 2 diabetes strongly in your family? Like, is there a large genetic component? Some people get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes when they're very, very young. And for those people, there's probably like less of an ability to go back to a high carb diet, because for whatever reason, genetically, their body doesn't do well with carbohydrates. If we have people who maybe like, healthy for most of their life, and then some big stressful event happens, like COVID, for example, which was true for a lot of people. And then, eating goes out the window, they're not going to the gym anymore, and, they're eating lots of sugar, lots of refined foods. They're not like moving their body at all. They've got all these nutrient deficiencies. There's probably a little bit more hope for those people in terms of, yes, committing to a good, healthy, energy dense, low carb diet with plenty of nutrients, addressing their nutrient deficiencies. Those people I find can get to a place where maybe they can be a little bit more flexible, once they've reversed their type 2 diabetes, they've got a good control on their blood sugars. They might be able to start bringing carbohydrates back in to a slightly higher degree and tolerate that just fine. But yeah, I guess that's like a question that's still a bit up in the air as to, do we have to do that diet forever or not? But the good news is, what we do know is you can reverse type 2 diabetes with a low carb diet. And this isn't necessarily in the literature, but just based on my clinical experience, you will reverse it faster if it's also an energy dense diet with lots of healthy fats.
Brilliant. That's such a hopeful message and such a practical takeaway as well. I mean, be it with people with type 2 diabetes or whatever the reason for trying a low carbohydrate, diet, they miss the fat piece and feel terrible as a result. And as you very astutely put, protein is wonderful building block, but it's not as robust as an energy source as carbohydrates or glycogen or fats and ketones, right? So yeah, really, really enjoyed that piece. Actually, there's a few people I want to send that clip specifically to.
Awesome.
When it comes to type 1 diabetes, I know you did, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Is it Crisco? The trial? CSIRO.
Yeah, so that's the organization that we collaborated with.
Understood. Okay. But it was a back trial on type 1 diabetes. Could you tell us about the trial, how it came about, and what surprised you most from it?
Yeah. So, I did a PhD focused on low carbohydrate diets for type 1 diabetes management. It was a 4-year process. And so we did like a lot of research studies before we actually got to the clinical trial. So everything was well thought out, but we won't go through all of that. In regards to the clinical trial itself, I guess just to give a bit of background, with type 1 diabetes, it is different to type 2 diabetes in the sense that people with type 1 diabetes have an absolute insulin deficiency. And so what that means is the beta cells of the pancreas, they get destroyed via an autoimmune process. And so they can no longer make sufficient insulin. If we compare that quickly to type 2 diabetes, at least initially, people with type 2 are making plenty of insulin. There is no problem with their ability to make insulin. In fact, they're making too much insulin because the bodies are a bit resistant to it, right? At a very end stage in type 2 diabetes, if it's really not well managed and someone's had it for years or decades, their pancreas can burn out and they can sort of fall into a state of having an absolute insulin deficiency and requiring injections. But that's like a very long drawn out process. Whereas if we think about type 1, it can almost happen overnight. That autoimmune condition can be so rapid that, people can kind of just like wake up or not wake up in the hospital sometimes. And then they need to give injections, multiple daily injections of insulin for the rest of their life. So it's a very intense condition, very different to type 2 diabetes. Now, interestingly, with type 1 diabetes, it's not well researched. So different dietary interventions for managing type 1 diabetes, there's hardly any research behind it. In fact, when you look at the clinical practice guidelines for type 1 diabetes and you go down to the diet section, like what should these people eat, it literally just has like one sentence. And it's just like, there is no research or insufficient research. Revert to the Australian dietary guidelines or the population level guidelines. And so when you look at the population level guidelines, and this is true for every country that has them, that has a little disclaimer in it. And that says, no, don't use these guidelines if you have a medical condition, because these guidelines have not been tested for specialized medical conditions. And type 1 diabetes is absolutely a medical condition that is severely impacted by diet, is probably like right up there at the top in terms of medical conditions that are impacted by diet, right? Because these people are quite literally manually taking over the job of their pancreas, and they have to, every time they eat, they have to predict what are their blood sugar levels going to do before it happens, and then estimate the amount of insulin they need. Like, that is absolutely so difficult to do. And they have to do it 10, 20, 30 times a day. So it really shocked me that there was such little evidence for this clinical population. And that is essentially why I went out to do type 1 diabetes research for my PhD. And, I focused immediately on low carbohydrate diets, because when you look in the research for type 2 diabetes, there is so much research to show that low carbohydrate diets are the most effective dietary intervention for type 2. And because the primary management target is the same. So for both diabetes types, the primary management target is to control blood sugars in a safe and healthy range. So with that considered, I wanted to see, could we apply the research from type 2 diabetes in people with type 1? So that was essentially like the crux of my thesis. The other issue that I was seeing and identifying is that people with type 1 diabetes were becoming more and more overweight and obese. So we used to call type 1 diabetes lean diabetes. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term, but essentially the way they identified type 1 versus type 2 back in the day is if you were skinny, it was type 1. If you were overweight, it was type 2, right? And that's how we thought of it. That was like a clear characteristic. But now you can't apply that, same kind of logic, because 60% of people with type 1, at least in Australia, are overweight. And so what's actually happening is they are becoming insulin resistant. And so if you are injecting a hormone multiple times a day, that is quite literally keeping you alive, and you develop a resistance to that hormone, it becomes quite terrifying. And so the beautiful thing about low carb diets as a therapy or a management strategy in type 1 diabetes is low carbohydrate diets can improve blood sugar control with less insulin. Whereas if you look at, all the research for type 1, it's all about how can we get more insulin into people to get their blood sugars down, right? Which is not a great strategy.
Yeah. I mean, it seems really, it seems so simple now when you put it like that, of if you have to regulate insulin yourself, just reduce make the day easy, give yourself a break by not having as much need or demand for insulin. Is that the sort of premise?
Yeah, it sounds super logical when we talk about it now, but when you think about someone who's just been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, usually when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, it's a little bit of a life and death situation. Like, a lot of people come close to quite literally dying when they are diagnosed. It's a very severe condition before you've identified it, right? And the longer you leave it, the worse it can become. And so these people have, just faced death, and they're in the hospital, and, they're being told you have to inject this amount of insulin many, X amount of times a day, and you must eat this amount of carbohydrates with that insulin injection or before that insulin injection. So oftentimes they get put on this fixed insulin regime. So it's just like, okay, don't do anything crazy. Just follow this exact regime and you'll be okay for a while. And so because they're so scared and frightened, they do exactly what they're told. And then oftentimes they just keep hearing that same advice. Okay, this is the amount of carbs you need to eat. This is the amount of insulin you need to inject. So it really gets ingrained into someone with type 1 diabetes that carbohydrates are essential. They need to eat a certain amount of carbohydrates multiple times a day. Now, with modern technology, we have continuous glucose monitors, we have insulin pumps, and all these great things that help people manage their blood sugars when they have type 1 diabetes. So it has become a little bit, I guess, easier for people with type 1 to have that confidence to make changes to their diet. But I do just want to highlight that point, because I think a lot of people who don't have type 1 kind of look at type 1 and they're just like, well, why wouldn't you just go on a low carbohydrate diet? You know, like, I don't understand why these people aren't just doing that. It seems so easy, seems so logical. But we have to put ourselves in their shoes. And when it comes to my clinical trial, we recruited 20 people from across Australia. The average duration that they'd been living with type 1 diabetes for before they started the study was 20 years. So for most of these people, for most, if not all of their life, they have been told that they have to eat a high carbohydrate diet. They have to eat carbs multiple times a day. They can't go too long without eating carbs. If they feel sick, if they feel dizzy, eat carbs, right? It's just like the answer to everything. And most of the time, that's like the only dietary advice they've been given.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
like it was, sorry?
Sorry, you go. I was just enthusiastically interrupting again.
It's okay. All I was going to say then was, you know, it required a lot of education, a huge amount of education before these people were even like comfortable with the idea of restricting carbohydrates. So it's super interesting because, like, you know, when you're looking at type 2 diabetes or you're looking at just weight loss, those people, like, you know, they don't have to think about how their medications are going to change most of the time. They don't have to think about, oh my gosh, you know, am I going to get hypoglycemia? You know, am I going to like get ketoacidosis? They don't need to think about these life-threatening situations. They can kind of take a risk and just try a different diet. But with type 1 diabetes, it is so much more difficult to make dietary changes. So we tried to support those people as much as we could. But I think it's really important to make that point because, you know, when you look at the results, and the results were fantastic, don't get me wrong, but when you take into account that, you know, they'd been living with type 1 diabetes for 20 years, it was so ingrained into them that they should follow a high carb diet, and for them to achieve the results they did in our study, like, it was so profound. And I think that's the sort of thing you can't really get across when you publish a paper. You know, it's very scientific, it's very outcomes based. But really, I think, you know, that was the most incredible thing that, you know, we were able to, because we put these people on a low carb diet for 12 weeks. It wasn't a very long time. 12 weeks, that's all we had time for. And HbA1c levels, which is your average kind of glucose control marker, they dropped from an average of 7.7 to 7.1 in 12 weeks. So a lot of people who are familiar with the power of low carb might say, that's not a very big drop. You know, I've seen it go down to 5 in, you know, like type 2 diabetes patients, or 5.5 or whatever. But we have to think about, this was just 12 weeks. And these people had been living with type 1 diabetes. Their HbA1c had been sitting at 7.7 for decades, right? And so we were able to get that down much closer to the optimal management target, which is less than 7. So less than 7 is kind of what people with diabetes are aiming for. So we got it down to 7.1. And we were able to do that with less insulin. So their insulin use dropped by an average of about 15 units per day. And so again, you know, it kind of makes that blood sugar control improvement even more impressive, right? Because that kind of shows us that we were able to also improve their insulin sensitivity, which reduces their risk of like weight issues and, you know, cardiovascular issues, inflammation, and other autoimmune diseases as well.
Brilliant. It's so interesting and such important work you do, because you're educating people on a number of different topics where the consensus assumptions they're reasoning up from might not be serving them very well anymore, be it changing the assumptions around calories, changing the assumption around basal metabolic rate, changing the assumptions around type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So it is important work you're doing, and has big knock-on effects for people's lives. A friend of mine just recently got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, so I will send her this this episode, and she'll maybe the start of that journey. Who knows where it goes? You're super fascinating, and an absolute boatload. I'm having such a good time learning from you. But I'm sure you have better things to do than drone on with me. So we'll end with a few quick fire questions, if that's all good.
Yeah, sure.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. So if you could run any study in the world with no constraints, no budget, you can have as many participants as you want. You can throw billions at it. You can do whatever. There's no constraints. What study would you want to run, or what would you want to be testing?
Wow. I think that can I pick two?
Yeah, be greedy. Go for
I,
it.
I feel like, if I didn't say more research in type 1 diabetes, like that would just be, ridiculous, given the fact that even though I did contribute to the literature, there is still such little evidence in that area, which is, it's not acceptable. And so what I would find really interesting if you had like unlimited funds for type 1 diabetes is to compare a low carbohydrate diet and a high carbohydrate diet, both with real whole foods, no processed foods or minimally processed foods. Because, I think food quality plays such an important role in your blood sugar control and your insulin sensitivity. And because there's such little research in type 1 diabetes, when you look at like the low carb versus high carb comparisons, they're not controlling for diet quality, really. I mean, we tried to in our study, but even then it still wasn't perfect, right? And I mean, by the way, our study was crowdfunded. So quite literally, I put out ads on Instagram and Facebook, asked people to donate, and that's how we got money for our study. And, there's just not much funding available for these types of things. So it might sound like a bit of a simple concept, but to do a good quality study like that, we're talking millions of dollars. So I would so be interested in that, because again, like, yes, on paper, low carb sounds like the right answer and the right approach, but people with type 1 have got it for life, remember? So we also want to know, can they eat a higher carbohydrate diet maybe for periods of their life, or, for the rest of their life, possibly if they don't have insulin resistance, and still thrive with type 1 diabetes? I would personally think that many people could, but we need more research on that. So that would be one. And then the other one would be, to do with this whole eat more to lose weight approach. I mean, in my clinic, I have seen, hundreds of people increase their calorie intake, sometimes double their calorie intake, and lose weight and keep it off. We have a very small case series of patients. There were 10 patients that showed by eating more calories, they were able to lose on average 10 kilograms per person. But that's just, a very basic case study, of clinical practice. It's not a proper clinical trial. And so it'll be so interesting to actually do a clinical trial where we're testing people's metabolic rates, and we're looking at, how we optimize those metabolic rates with this type of approach, what sort of weight they can lose compared to someone on a standard eat less, move more approach, what symptoms they experience, how they feel, their quality of life. And then also, follow them up for 10, 20 years and find out what they choose to do after the study ends, but also what their, weight and body composition is like. As much as I, preach this and I've seen this and I've put all this different evidence together to come to this conclusion, there is still no good, solid clinical trial that is testing exactly what I'm talking about. And so I feel like that would be, such an important piece of research, because weight loss is like the number one thing, right? Everyone wants to figure out how they do it.
I have to ask about your 2 cents on the GLP-1 agonists.
Well, look, I mean, it's an interesting one. I was, super against weight loss medications just in general when, the hype around them started increasing again. But I must say, I have seen some patients use them to their advantage. Now, those patients are putting in a lot of effort with their diet, right? And I think that's where people can go wrong. Like if you take a pill or you take an injection that promises weight loss, especially these types of medications, they change your physiology so that A, you can't eat many calories, B, you can't absorb those calories. And so essentially what that means is you're not getting enough energy. So I'm not a fan of that, right? Because metabolic rate is going to drop. And that's what we see. The people that are losing 10, 20, 30 kilos with these medications, they're stuck because the weight just comes piling back on when they stop or they try to eat normally again. However, the patients who are willing to do the work with their diet, so yes, they might be taking these medications for whatever reason, but they prioritize protein. They're doing resistance training to build muscle or at least retain their muscle. And they're using the absolute lowest dose possible. Perhaps they're also monitoring their blood sugars and looking after that. They're being sure that they're not falling short in terms of their micronutrients. They're monitoring those regularly. And that's what I help patients with. You know, they tend to do okay. They tend to do okay with little side effects, but it's because they're putting in the work, right? They're not just relying on these medications. And so I think, you know, these sorts of weight loss therapies, they can be effective. Like even if we think about bariatric surgery, we can't just say it's completely ineffective. For some people, it really is life-changing. But the people who get the best results with the least amount of side effects are also changing their diet, monitoring their health, and they're very much aware of how they feel. They're intuitive with what their body's telling them. And I think that's such an important skill because, you know, if you're listening to your body and responding to that, you can kind of identify if things start to go, you know, the wrong way. Like if your energy's coming down or your mental health is kind of like collapsing a little bit or your cognitive function is going down, you know, if any of those things kind of come up, then you know to put on the brakes. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that intuition or ability to kind of listen to their body, and they sort of learn to just push through all of those things until it goes too far. So yeah, individualized for sure, but yeah.
Watch this space. Okay. Yeah, it is interesting. It just feels like a lot of what we spoke about today. I kept wanting to sort of put in more, what about the context of GLP-1s, i.e., you know, if people are just chronically malnourished because they're just eating less, or, you know, nutritional deficiencies, is had to ask. I have a boatload more questions and could continue to ask you, but I will save them maybe for another day, maybe part two at some point. Who knows? But you're also up to awesome work with your practice, your clinic. Could you tell us where we can find you? Where can we keep up to what you're up to and learn more?
Yep. So I'm most active on Instagram. My Instagram is Jessica Turton _dietitian. So like I try to kind of just put little snippets of information on there for people to kind of digest and absorb and think about. I do have an online dietetic practice, a team of 3 exceptional dietitians, and we consult with people all over the world. And so, yeah, that's Ellipse Health, so ellipsehealth.com.au. And we very much delve into individual needs, goals, and requirements. So, you know, I know sometimes, you know, when you're listening to a conversation like this one, if you're someone who's sitting there going, well, I want to eat more, I want to lose weight, this all sounds really, really interesting, but I still don't know where to start. I still don't know how to figure out my energy requirements, what to do. Please know that this is not common knowledge. You're not supposed to know that, right? Like we don't get taught this in school. Maybe we should, I don't know, but we don't. We don't have these tools. So don't feel silly or like, you know, you're not doing the right thing because you're doing the best you can. Our job is quite literally to take all the difficult stuff and figure that out for you and then give it to you in really like digestible bite-sized pieces that work for you and your lifestyle. And I guess the other thing is like, I'm never going to tell someone to do something they don't want to do, right? So we collaborate and we figure out together what is the best approach moving forward based on their requirements, their history, their blood tests, and so on.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put everything we mentioned and, you know, all your links in the show notes. But just sincerely, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I learned so I learned a boatload, and it's start my day over here in the UK. So already a great day. So thanks so much for taking time. Really appreciate you coming.
No problem. Thank you so much.